People usually begin with this photograph. The Sultana at Helena, Arkansas, April 26, 1865. One day before its boilers exploded. At first, it seems like the whole story is right there. A steamboat buried under men, crowded rails, packed decks. Every level carrying more people than any riverboat was meant to carry. And the simple version almost tells itself. Too many men on one boat, a boiler explosion in the night, and then a disaster the country forgot. But the photograph does not explain what happened. It is only the part of the story that survived in one image. It does not show the prison camps these men had just come out of, or the prisoner exchange system that left them waiting to be moved north. It does not show the rolls and head counts at Vicksburg, the officers working with bad numbers, or the suspicion that moving men onto different boats might be part of someone else's fraud. And it cannot show the boiler itself, the plates, the repair, the scale and sediment, the weaknesses no one on deck could see. It does not show what came after the river went dark either. The investigation, the blame, passing from one person to another, the survivors who tried to make the country remember, and how a disaster became known mostly for one thing: being forgotten. So we start with the photograph, but we do not stop there. After the photograph, we have to go back to the men on the decks. They were not ordinary passengers buying a place on a northbound boat. Many were paroled Union prisoners, newly released from Confederate prisons. Some had come through places like Andersonville and Cahaba. By April 1865, they had already been hungry, sick, exposed, counted, moved, and made to wait. Then the war began to end. Lee had surrendered. The system that had kept them trapped was breaking apart. But for these men, the end of the war did not come in one clean moment. It came as another line, another roll call, another camp. For months, prisoner exchange had been tangled in policy, numbers, and army decisions. When release came, it did not make them travelers choosing their way home. It made them paroled men, still waiting for the army to move them along. At Vicksburg, near Camp Fisk, the process looks simple on paper. Gather the men, count them, put them on boats, send them north. Camp Fisk was not supposed to be the destination. It was a holding point, a place where the Army tried to turn scattered survivors into a list of men ready to leave. But paper can make things look cleaner than they were. It can make exhausted people look easier to move than they really are. These men needed care. They also had to be moved, and that made them a problem for the Army to solve. We do not need invented diary lines to understand what home meant here. Home meant a bed outside the prison system, a meal not measured by captivity, a morning when the next order might finally take a man away from the war instead of deeper into it. That is what changes the Sultana photograph. The crowd on the decks was not just a crowd going home. It was a group of men still being moved through the last machinery of the war. They had been let out of prison. They had not yet been let out of the system. And once a system starts treating exhausted men as a transport problem, the next question becomes dangerous. Who decides how many can fit? At Vicksburg, the dangerous question did not seem dangerous at first. It looked like paperwork. A count, a roll, a payment, a boat at the landing. The Army had thousands of paroled men to move north. Steamboat captains could be paid to carry them. That did not make every decision corrupt, but it changed how people looked at the crowd. A weakened man could be entered as a number, and that number could mean money. That is where the simple version of the Sultana story starts to fail. In that version, one greedy captain sees a chance to make money, overloads his boat, and the disaster follows. Captain J. Cass Mason did want the job of carrying them north. Money mattered. Reuben Hatch's name comes up in the corruption stories around the loading. But if the story stops there, it becomes too neat. The records suggest something messier. At Vicksburg, officers were not just looking at a crowd. They were looking at roles, totals, suspicion, rank, and time. Some worried that if the men were split between boats, the paperwork could be gamed. A man might be counted twice. A captain might be paid for a soldier he did not carry. That fear did not make the deck safer. It made one boat easier to count. The later report also rejected a convenient excuse, that the men themselves needed to stay together. It found no real basis for that. These were not passengers choosing seats beside friends. They were exhausted men being sorted by a process that wanted the numbers to come out clean. And there were other boats. That detail matters. If other steamers were available, the question is not only, why did one boat take so many men? It is also, why did one boat become the answer? At the same time, the Sultana was not just empty space waiting at the landing. She had stopped with a boiler problem. The repair was quick. The boat was useful, profitable, and considered ready enough to keep moving. Ready enough is where danger begins. At Vicksburg, exhausted men became a load to be counted, paid for, and moved. And the system could explain that to itself as normal. By the time the Sultana left Vicksburg, the loading decision had already done what the photograph would later hide. It had put the weight of men ahead of the risk to the machine. So the next part of the story is not just how many men were on board. It is what kind of machine was carrying them. After Vicksburg, it is tempting to blame the boiler. The boat had a boiler problem. The repair was quick. The decks were overloaded. Then the boilers exploded. It sounds like a simple chain of events, but it was not. A riverboat boiler depended on balance. Fire turned water into steam. The water helped keep the iron from overheating. The iron had to hold the pressure long enough for the engine to use it. That balance worked only while the margins held. The popular version is easy to picture. The Sultana overloaded, the boat leaning or rocking, water shifting away from part of the boiler, iron getting too hot, pressure finding the weak place. You can see why that version survives. It gives the disaster a clean shape. But a clean story is not the same as an answer. The official record did not clearly support the idea of a dramatic lurch at the moment of the explosion. Later technical writers have also questioned whether rocking alone can explain it. They point instead to a less simple machine. Weakened boiler material, scale and sediment, design limits, repair history, and stored energy inside the boiler. That does not mean the crowd on the decks stops mattering. It means the crowd was one strain among several. The men added weight. The river added work. The quick repair added uncertainty. And if the later analysis is right, scale, sediment, and weakened metal made the boiler less forgiving. No single part had to look dramatic. That is what makes it harder to see. From the outside, a dangerous system can look normal. The stacks smoke. The wheel turns. Men stand at the rails. The boat is treated as ready enough to keep going. Inside, the margin can already be getting smaller. The boiler was not the whole story. It failed because enough risks were allowed to meet in one place. That is less satisfying than blaming one bad repair or one greedy decision. But it is more frightening because the danger did not wait for one dramatic moment to begin. It was building while the boat still looked useful, while paperwork called the men a load, while the repair looked finished. while the Sultana kept doing what a steamboat was supposed to do, moving north, taking on coal, pushing against the river, and giving exhausted men a place to sleep. By the time the final hours began, the risk did not need to announce itself. It had already been accepted as ordinary. At Helena on April 26th, someone took the photograph. That matters. By then, part of the danger was visible from shore. The Sultana was no longer just a name in transport paperwork, or a boat with a repaired boiler, or another steamer carrying soldiers north. She was in plain view. Crowded decks, lined rails, men packed wherever there was room to stand or sit. And still, the trip went on. The war was almost over. The releases had gone through. The loading was done. The boiler repair had been accepted as enough. The men had been moved out of prison camps, counted into rolls, transferred to the river, and put aboard. No single step had to look reckless on its own. At Helena, nothing stopped. Later, during the night of April 26th into April 27th, the Sultana reached Memphis. Cargo came off. Coal went on. The stop looked like routine river work, the kind of work steamboats were built around. But above that work were men who were not ordinary passengers. Many were former prisoners of war. They had survived captivity. After that came release, more waiting, and another move made by order. Some were weak. Some were sick. Some were simply exhausted. On that crowded boat, there was not much left to choose. Stay aboard, hold a place, rest if the deck allowed it. Then Memphis began to fall behind. The Sultana pushed upriver again, into a Mississippi running high with spring floodwater. The shore lights thinned. The river was dark. The current mattered, though no one on board could know yet how much it would matter before morning. By about 2 o'clock north of Memphis, the Sultana was still moving. The men were still aboard. The repaired boilers were still beneath them. The river was still high. All those ordinary steps had carried the boat almost to the end. A little after 2 in the morning, north of Memphis, the Sultana was still pushing upriver in the dark. Then the boilers failed. We usually call it an explosion, and it was. But the word can make the disaster sound too quick, as if the worst of it happened in one flash. For the men on board, the danger did not end with the blast. First came steam, fire, broken timber, and a boat coming apart under a crowd with almost no room to move. Some men were on deck. Some were asleep. Many had come out of prison camps weak, sick, or worn down. Now they were in the water, at night. The Mississippi was high and cold, with a current too strong for exhausted men to fight for long. The shore was somewhere in the dark, but no one could tell how far. A few hours earlier, home had felt closer than it had in years. Now the question was smaller. What can I hold on to? The explosion began it. The river took over. To live, a man had to get clear of the wreck, stay above the water in soaked clothes and boots, find something that would float, and hold on long enough to be found. Rescue came slowly. Boats moved toward the wreck. People on shore came with lanterns. Smoke, darkness, and current made every rescue take time. Seeing a man, steering toward him, getting close enough, pulling him in. By morning, the Sultana was no longer just a boat that had exploded. There was smoke over the river, survivors wrapped in blankets, names missing from rolls, families waiting for men who would not come home. And now the question changes. If so many warning signs had been visible before the explosion, why did action come so late? Only when rescue was all that remained. After the Sultana exploded, it did not disappear into silence. Reports followed. So did hearings. Men in uniform had to answer questions about the boat, the lists, the loading, and the count. That matters, because the easy ending would be to say the country simply looked away. It was not that simple. For a while, the government did look. Statements were gathered, rolls were checked. A river disaster was translated into numbers an office could compare. And the record showed more than enough to make the picture uncomfortable. It showed a steamboat carrying far too many men. It showed that other boats had been available. It showed officers and contractors circling the question that should have been forced before the Sultana left Vicksburg. Could this vessel safely carry the load being put on it? But records can show a failure without fixing responsibility. The blame kept moving. It moved through the loading, through the captain and the money around transport contracts, through officers worried about fraud, bad counts, and paperwork trouble, and through the machine itself, where the explosion could be explained one way, then complicated by repair history, weak iron, sediment, river handling, and uncertainty. Frederick Speed was court-martialed. For a moment, it looked as if the system had found one name to carry the weight. Then the result was overturned and dismissed. That left a cold ending. Not silence. Not justice either. The dead did not leave behind a clear public verdict. They left lists that did not fully agree. Reports sharp enough to accuse, but not strong enough to settle the matter. And survivors who remembered what the record could not hold together. So the question is no longer just who caused the Sultana disaster. It is how a visible danger passed through so many hands that responsibility became almost impossible to keep in one place. People often say the Sultana was forgotten. That is not exactly wrong, but it is not the whole truth. The disaster was in newspapers. It was investigated. Survivors talked about it, wrote about it, gathered to remember it, and kept returning to the same bitter fact. Men who had survived prison and war were lost on the last stretch home. So it was not a secret. The harder question is why a disaster like this never found a firm place in the country's memory. April 1865 was already too much for one nation to hold. Lincoln had been murdered. Booth was being hunted. Confederate armies were surrendering. People were mourning, celebrating, counting the dead, and trying to understand what the war had left behind. Then came the Sultana. It did not fit easily anywhere. It was tied to prison camps, but the prison story seemed to be ending. It was a river disaster, but it came at the end of a war. It was a scandal of money and paperwork, but also a failure of metal, steam, and inspection. It had victims by the hundreds, maybe more than 1,000. Even the numbers would not settle. That made it hard to remember as one story. One villain would have been easier. One cause. One exact total. One simple lesson. The Sultana did not give people that. The Helena photograph gives us the part memory can take in quickly. A boat, a crowd, a warning in plain sight. But the photograph is not the whole story. It cannot show the roles, the contracts, the repair choices, the boilerplates, the high river, the dark water, or the official papers that found failure but left responsibility unsettled. That is why the survivors' work matters. They were not preserving trivia. They were asking the country to keep looking at something it never quite knew how to place. So maybe forgotten is the wrong word, or at least too easy a word. The Sultana was remembered in pieces, in lists, in reunions, in newspaper columns pushed aside by larger news, in local histories, family stories, archives, and memorial efforts. But as a national story, it never became one clear shape. The men on the Sultana had already been countered and moved by systems that failed to see them clearly. After they died, memory did something similar. The evidence remained, the meaning drifted. So we come back to the photograph. Not because it explains everything, because it asks us to look longer. At men who almost made it home. At the system that moved them like freight. At the fragile machine beneath them. At the river in the dark. And at a country that never found a clear place for their story.